Um, I want to begin by just thanking you all for being here this afternoon. I know there's a lot of tension. I know there's a lot of questions, a lot of wonderings about how this is all going to work. And I want you to know that whatever you're thinking about or worrying about, I can almost guarantee you that somebody at central office has been thinking about and worrying about the same thing. So know that we are putting a lot of time and effort into developing these plans. And at the same time, we also know we don't have all the answers yet. So we really do welcome your thinking, your questions, your support in figuring out some of the things that are all new to all of us as we go through this process. So, this is just a little overview of what we're going to cover, but I really would love to spend a bulk of our time answering questions. So, I'll share a few slides, but I'd also really love for you to feel free to ask whatever it is that you're most wondering about right now. We really appreciated the feedback from our focus group last week, and some of you have also given feedback through your school leaders, and that was very helpful in some of the plans that, as we continue to develop new drafts. To start with, I'd love to just go over a little bit around what a day looks like. And some of you may have seen this. I believe it was shared last week in the focus groups, but just kind of to keep in mind that this is what the day looks like for a student and what the day looks like for a teacher. So for students, there is a requirement for the family to complete an attestation before they come in. And while I don't have all the specifics of how that works, I do know that our schools that have been doing this with their ILC students have experience with this. And so it's really a matter of scaling up what's already in place, not creating it from scratch. Students will be traveling to school. Bus routes will be arranged based on who's in the AM cohort and the PM cohort and arriving at school. And then they will be in their classrooms in a specific seat. And in dual language, I know one of the big questions is, well, are they going to switch rooms? Are they not going to switch rooms? Do I have to move as a teacher? Do I have to try to figure out how to share space with another teacher and all of that? And the answer that I've gotten from our safety committee is that students can do the moving, particularly because the model we're looking at, students would remain in one classroom each day, and they would switch at midweek to a different classroom, and therefore there is time for them to clean in between, especially with Wednesdays being remote instruction. So they would be able to be in your classroom, you would be able to keep your own space, and your teaching partner, if you're on a two-person team, could keep their own space, and the students would do the switching. They would have a designated workstation in one room and a designated workstation in the other, just like they always have. So that's just a little look at what the student's day looks like. The teacher day, this is a little bit more detailed, but it's important to look at like what your chunks of time are. The student time in the morning and in the afternoon are 2 hours and 15 minutes each, which means there is a short amount of that whack time at the beginning of the day, and then the first group arrives, and then there's a pretty extended break in the middle of the day. There's 2.5 hours between your AM cohort and your PM cohort, which is where you would have an hour of planning time, half hour of lunch time, some additional whack time, and time for those family connections before the afternoon group would arrive. So this really does break up your day, and that 2.5 hours is time for custodians to come in and do cleaning in rooms in between your two classes. So it is not an expectation that you do cleaning of your own room. That would be done by someone else because your time will be taken up planning and preparing for instruction. So, a couple things about the day in a life, and then Leticia, maybe you can throw any questions to me as I don't have that open right now. We know that the hybrid model includes an AM and a PM group, that there would be 2 hours and 15 minutes for each group of in-person learning time. And asynchronous learning time would be the other part of their day, either prior to them coming to school or at the end of the day. And during that time, that's when specialist time like PE, music, and library would take place. So those would not be happening in person. They would be happening in the other half of the day remotely, similar to what they are doing now. That might be a time when some supplemental small group supports are in place for some students. That might be done by paras, interventionists, etc. And right now, our plan is for 2 days in each language. So students would be in, say, Spanish for 2 days on Monday, Tuesday, in English on Thursday and Friday. And on Wednesdays, because they are doing remote, you could see both groups and do both languages. And that day, that part of the schedule could look a lot like it does now on Wednesdays, which many of you have worked out something that works well for you. There's definitely some flexibility there. I believe right now on Wednesdays that the plan would be that some of that time would be synchronous remote instruction, but I believe some of those details are still being worked out in the negotiating team, and so I can't speak to exactly how much time or what that looks like yet.
So we have a question. Will Group A receive breakfast in the classroom?
Right now, what I believe is that there are no plans to do any meals at school. So any kind of meals would be similar to now, where they are going to be delivered or picked up for students to do all their meals at home. There will be no cafeteria service in the school. There will be no supervised recess times in the school. The plan is to minimize that so that safety protocols can stay in place and so that we don't have students taking off masks to do meals.
And breaks, because there aren't any provided breaks, does that mean the teacher is then providing any sort of breaks in the classroom?
I believe so. Those details have not been shared yet, but because it's a 2 hour and 15-minute chunk, we realize kindergartners can't sit still for that long, and so yeah, you obviously might need to do some kind of a brain break or a stand up and a get the wiggles out kind of video or something in place or something like that. I do not know yet if there's going to be an allowable time for a teacher to say take their children out to march around the campus or things like that. Those are details that I think will be worked out with once the schools have their safety plan in place and then with your administrators. So that has not been shared.
Will staff that have students in the building where they work be provided any sort of childcare?
I don't believe that there's any accommodations for childcare. Similar to during remote instruction this fall, that is something that essentially the teacher and their family or the staff member and their family would have to work out.
And what about bathroom use for students?
There will, I'm sure, as part of the safety protocol, be protocols around bathroom use and what needs to be done in order to follow those. That would be part of the school safety plan.
And last one for paras. Are paras going to be going to the classrooms?
That's a good question, and those are some details that have not been fully worked out yet. But because paras schedules might shift, there might be some need for to have paras in school for some of that hybrid time. But there also might be needs in remote time, and so that will also have to be basically documented of who might have accommodations and who might not, and then those para schedules will likely have to shift from what they currently are. So with that, I believe all of you probably saw this in the first half of the webinar, but this is the basic schedule, what a basic schedule would look like with a two-class model for a two-teacher model with a switching back and forth after 2 days of instruction in one language and then 2 days in the other. And this really is around safety. Now, you might be wondering, what if I'm a standalone teacher? What if I teach both languages? Could I teach, an hour of one, an hour of another? And the short answer to that is yes, you probably could, because if you're seeing the same group of kids every day and you wanted to, make that adaptation, you might be able to. On the other hand, you might also want to look at your team as a whole and make sure that you're aligned as a team. And so if some folks are teaching remote and some folks are teaching hybrid on your team, and some have two groups, two classes, and some only have one, you may make a decision to make sure that you all align with what you're teaching so that you have a more consistent schedule. But there are definitely some spaces in there for you to make decisions at the team and at the school level about the specifics of how that looks. What we can't do is allow students to switch halfway through a 2 hour and 15-minute block and move to another room. For safety reasons, that can't happen. They need to stay put and they need to stay with one teacher to allow that cleaning in between. So that's really what drives the schedule. We realize that's not ideal in terms of language use. And it may also be a matter of if they're getting English on Monday and Tuesday live, perhaps more of the asynchronous work that they do that afternoon is in Spanish. Maybe in the afternoon they're getting on iStation, they're getting on Imagine Learning Espanol, they're doing some of the asynchronous activities that have been assigned to them for Spanish, or they're taking home a book bag with Spanish books so that they can do some Spanish work in the other half of the day when they're at home. Are there other questions before we move on?
Yes, school counselors, will they be going remote or will they be in schools?
That's a good question and one I don't have an answer for right now. I don't know. And I'm sure there is somebody who's thought about that already, but I don't know the answer. I'm sorry.
And what about accommodations? When will staff be notified if they've been approved or denied?
That is definitely an HR question. And if you filled out a survey, but you didn't actually contact HR to request an accommodation, you need to make sure you do that. Just filling out the survey is not enough. You actually have to fill out a specific request if you have a specific reason for needing an accommodation. So make sure you do that because those are the data that we're going to be using to figure out staffing configurations and what that will look like, and whether we have to do some reassignments and where those reassignments might be.
Is it possible that staffing would require to change program from a two teacher to a one teacher in March?
That is a great question, and I actually want to show you in just a moment. I'll move forward because I think most of this we've already covered. I want to move forward and show you just some ideas of kind of what staffing might look like. And before I do, I want to give you a caveat. These are really preliminary ideas. They are not set in stone, and they may change because some of them even there's a little bit of a it looks different in DL, as you all know, and so I want to just be clear that like whatever I show you right now, please don't take that as you know as this is it, this is what we're doing. It's still just these are ideas, and we're looking for feedback on those as well. So this is an example of what staffing configuration might look like. This is probably one of the easier ones. There are ones that are definitely more complicated. But this is, for example, a three-teacher team where about 60 to 70% of students are planning to come back in hybrid. In this model, ideally, we would have two teachers teaching in person, one in one language, one in the other, Spanish and English here, and then we would have our students divided into their groups, which are, similar to what you're doing now, really. But you would have class one would have an A group and a B group. A group comes in the morning, B group comes in the afternoon, and they would see the Spanish teacher Monday, Tuesday, and then group 1A and 1B would see the English teacher on Thursday, Friday, and the other group would do the opposite, right? That would leave one teacher teaching in both Spanish and English, handling the students that are remote. Does that mean that remote teacher has to speak both languages? Yes, it does. So that might change and it might shift who is doing the remote instruction and who is doing a standalone, essentially, from what it currently is. If there's a teacher on that team who has the language skills and also needs an accommodation to be remote. So, with that said, that's one way it could look, but there are of course, many other ways it could look based on a couple of factors. First of all, just how many students are coming back. That's going to drive the model more than anything because we have to figure out what those groups are. Also, knowing that some of our class sizes are fairly small, we might be able to be a little creative with the shifting of how many kids are in a group. So the numbers might not work out perfectly, but as long as they are within the contractual limits, we might reassign students and one class might be a little bigger or a little smaller, just based on how many kids signed up, how many families signed their students up for remote versus hybrid. Now, in some other configurations, this looks more complicated. So I want to show you another, and we're still reasoning through this. So this is not, like I said, it's not set in stone and it's not a done deal that it's going to be this way. But this, for example, is what it might look like on a four-teacher team with about 60 to 70% of students in hybrid. With that number, Likely you would need 3 groups to be remote and 5 groups to be in hybrid. That doesn't work out very cleanly. It'd be nice if it were 50% because then very cleanly we would have 2 teachers assigned to in person and 2 to remote. So, what does that mean? It means you're stuck with this group where you've got 1 hybrid group and then you've got 3 remote groups with this team of teachers. So, what does that mean? Well, it means a couple of things. It means that possibly those teachers might be teaching hybrid just for part of the time if they're able to come in person. Only 2 days a week and only half the day. And maybe the other half of the day they're in their classroom and they are teaching the students remotely, but they're from teaching from their classroom. And then on Thursdays and Fridays, they could be teaching from their classroom or from home. It wouldn't matter because they're teaching fully remote on Thursday, Friday. It could also mean that this teacher might have an accommodation to teach entirely in remote, and it might be that someone else, another staff member, might be supervising those students who are in the hybrid 3A group on Monday and Tuesday mornings, and their teacher is actually at home and is teaching them remotely. So there's some places where this might look creative in order to both meet the needs of our students and meet the needs of our staff. And so I just want to put that out there as yes, it looks a little more complicated, but that's what it might look like. Now, I know you heard earlier they said you're not going to have to teach both hybrid and remote. And that is the ideal that you're doing one or the other. And there are some of these where it might be very difficult to configure. And so I think what's best is for us to just think about, am I willing to do both? What does that look like? How does that impact me? How does it impact my students? And then please share what your thinking is on that as well. Because if it just feels like that's impossible, there's no way I could manage that, it's too much, we want to hear that. And we are still in negotiations around these things, and so that's a part of the bargaining work as well, to figure out what are we asking and is it reasonable. There were quite a few teachers, or not quite a few, but there were some teachers in ILC who wound up doing one hybrid and one remote so that they could actually still stay with all of their students. And so some of that has been done before, but we're trying to be very careful about not requiring something unless that teacher is able and willing. And so, like I said, this might look a little different. It might look like someone else supervising. It might look like the teacher working remotely. There's a number of ways this could look. And we have actually spelled this out for all the different percentages and then all the different 3, 4, and 5 person dual language teacher teams so that we have plans ready to go. For White Center teachers, where you've got both dual and non-dual, we've done it for both dual and for non-dual, and your configurations as a teaching team might be a combination of those two. But it is still doable for us to figure out a scenario in which we can make that work. So, yes, there's some places where this might look a little different, but what we would never be doing is having a teacher try to teach kids at home and live at the same time. That is absolutely off the table. And we also, as much as possible, would want people to stay in the same language for that block of time because we think for students and for staff that's going to keep it a lot simpler. I know we have a lot of things in the chat, obviously,
Yes.
so I'll do my best to try to answer as many questions as I can because I'm sure this is bringing up a lot of questions. And like I said, these are still very preliminary. I wanted to put a giant draft across it, but I don't know how to do that on Google Slides. So maybe some of you can teach me.
What about different grades being mixed?
You mean like
Like
split?
splits. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, I know we have a few places where that is the case. I think most of them are already at a level where those 2 grades would be coming back together at the same time anyway. As much as possible for the staffing portion of that, because we're talking about smaller groups, it's never one whole class. It's 2 groups within a class, just like it is now remotely. We try to keep those groups also by grade level as much as possible to make things easier. So for some of you, for example, I know we have a 4-5 team at Hilltop that's got some interesting configurations. Yes, you would have to do some shifting, to accommodate remote and hybrid, but we would try to figure out how many hybrid 4th grade groups do you need, how many remote 4th grade groups, how many 5th grade hybrid groups do you need, how many many remote fifth grade groups do you need, and then keep those groups as little cohorts. And with these half class groups, there's actually a little bit more wiggle room to do that kind of thing. So hopefully we can keep those, um, grouped and clustered in a way that will facilitate instruction.
There's questions about how we will be supporting staff and students of color who are more impacted and what kind of systems are being put in place to help these families if, quarantine is needed in the classroom.
I am not part of the safety planning, so I don't have a lot of answers for that. But what I do know is our district is a district with a very high number of students of color and families who are highly impacted. So that is a huge part of the planning in all of the safety protocols, in all of the figuring out what to do about quarantining and all of those things. We have had students in the ILC programs come into school and then have to, go back out because of a family member or something. We've had things like that come up. And having both remote instruction going on and hybrid allows for some of that so that we can shift a student if needed, to a different group in order to be able to continue instruction if they have to move back into remote. And we are anticipating that there's going to be cases of that coming up. What the superintendent shared earlier is that while we know those things are impacting our families, we also know that the safety protocols that have been put in place for our ILC has been very effective in that we have not had any transmissions within the school setting. And so I think, that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And as I've talked to some of the principals who've had ILC programs in their buildings during this time, they are feeling a lot calmer about it because they have seen that they've been able to do this and we're scaling up.
There's some concerns about teachers being exposed to twice as many students because they're seeing one group of students one day and one group of students the other day.
Yes, and I hear you. I wish there were an easy answer to that. If we could make everybody a standalone, great. But we can't because we don't have, not everybody's bilingual. Not everyone can just switch and start teaching in both languages. On the other hand, the more that our dual language teachers are able to be flexible in the modeling of that staffing configuration, the better. For example, if let's say you have three teachers on your team, but instead of having one person be completely remote, if all three teachers are able to do both some in school hybrid and some remote, for example, then you could have, a team of teachers where they're teaching hybrid 2 days and they're teaching remote the other two, and then they're seeing half as many kids. So there are some options and staffing configurations where that would minimize the number of kids that you are actually interacting with on a regular basis, but it does mean doing a combination of the two. And as we do our planning for instructional frameworks and all of that, we are really trying to consider that and think about consistency so that lessons shouldn't be drastically different if you're in person or if you're remote. That really it should be the same thing, and you might just have a few additional options in person of how you deliver some of that, but that what you're delivering is really essentially very consistent, which will make it easier for planning purposes, easier if you're trying to juggle more than one of those, and also easier to collaborate as a team across the different scenarios of what people on that team might be teaching. So that I think is really going to be key, that we try to keep things very consistent across.
And will those decisions be made at the school level or
Yeah,
with
what we are
admin?
providing is guidance. Even the schedule and what we've laid out, there's a few things that are non-negotiables around safety, but other than that, they are guidance. And so there's a lot of places within that where teacher teams will be able to think about what's going to best work for their students and for their team, and will be able to make a lot of instructional choices of how to make that work for them.
Lots of concerns about families not having the information, not being reached, not hearing back from everyone, and how will they know what they're committing to, and so that communication between families and the
Yeah,
district.
our family engagement department is really working on what that looks like and how we make sure that we are getting accurate information from every family and that they fully understand what their commitment is. We know that just sending out a survey isn't enough. So I know that they are working on plans for how we make sure that we communicate effectively with every family so that they can, know what that commitment is. Just to kind of put a heads up, some districts have told families they have to make one choice and that's their choice, and then that they're locked into that. I believe our district has not put that out in that kind of way, because I think they also understand that family situations may change and things might shift. And so while we don't want a lot of movement, we also don't want to lock families into once you've committed to this, you can't go back and then you're stuck with it because we know that that might not be realistic.
Sharing of materials, because students can't share, they're going to need twice as much materials. So how will that be supported?
That is very true. And I think, in dual language, we have kind of the double whammy of what do we do if we need twice as many notebooks or we need twice as many of these things? That is definitely something that we can support. Obviously, those will be school-based plans once you figure out exactly what you need. But in dual language in particular, we have been able to use some of our central funds to support some of those needs when they popped up when we realized that we were just going to need double of some things. And so that's something that as you work with your school team, as you work with your school administrator, administrators can definitely reach out to me and just say, hey, here's what we're struggling with, here's what we need to make this work, and we're happy to help.
And the maximum number of students in a classroom.
Yeah, I believe that is actually determined by the space that you have. Every principal has been given a map of their school that gives the exact number of capacity with the 6 foot distancing for every space in their school. So they already have that information. It's all been mapped out. With that said, with class sizes the ways that they are, right now, I believe in the elementary, our plan is to make sure that we don't have more than, I believe, 14 to 16 students in a room at any given time, that is the max. But I think in most cases, we're going to be looking at half of that because with an AM and a PM cohort, you can't go over your contractual limits for your total class size. And if you divide that in half, that's going to keep your class sizes fairly small. I anticipate most class sizes in elementary are going to look more like 10 to 14. So it should be pretty manageable within the space. It is going to look different than it has before. And we'll have to be a little creative with what that looks like and how you can, make that work.
Do you want to do a time check and also acknowledge that we have not answered all these questions that are being asked? So it's 5:06.
And just to let you know, we will be capturing and saving the chat. So if you have questions that came up on the chat here that we were not able to answer, I'll make sure that we're bringing all of those back. If they're DL specific questions, I'll do my best to be able to try to get that information out to you. And I'm hoping early next week to release a DL updates newsletter where we provide additional information about what's going on with the hybrid planning. But also, if there's any that are relevant to safety and to other areas, I'll make sure that those get passed on as well, and they will go to the people that are doing the additional planning in those areas.